In this video, I'm going to show you how to sew a super easy summer dress. For this project, you're going to need ribbon, elastic, thread, pins, scissors, measuring tape, and fabric. For the fabric, I'm using something cotton and non-stretch. We're going to start by draping the top of the dress. This can be done on a mannequin or on yourself if you don't have one. I like to do it out of a scrap fabric and then transfer it to my real fabric once I've decided I like the shape. We're going to create a little gathering under the bust, and then we're also going to pin a side seam. Then, using our scissors, we're going to cut away the extra fabric. Then finally, we're going to use a pencil to mark out the shape that we want. The shape really is up to you, and it's quite flexible what you decide to do at this step. So here I'm just marking out my armhole and where I place my pins for my side seam. And then I'm going to continue to cut away extra fabric and mark out the shape of my dress. Then you can take it off the mannequin and do the final trim of the fabric, keeping in mind a 1 centimeter seam allowance around every edge of this piece. Now you've worked out the pattern for the top of the dress. Now we're going to move on to the bottom of the dress. So we're going to measure out our large hip measurement and plug that into the formula to create our half circle skirt. So we're going to fold our fabric in half and place our pins mapping out the radius. And here I'm just mapping it out on the other side of the fabric. So placing our bodice piece back on the mannequin, we're going to slightly alter the placement of our pins for our circle skirt to create the triangle detail in the front of the dress. So I'm placing the center of my skirt to line up with the center of the dress, and then I'm making sure that the pins line up with the bottom of the bust. And then I'm just altering the pins in the center point and then continuing so they line up with the already existing pins that I placed earlier. Because I just pinned for half of the dress, I'm going to use my measuring tape to mirror out the other side of the dress. And with that all pinned out, I'm ready to cut away the new shape for the opening of our circle skirt. And then I can also cut my length measurement at this point as well. So now we have the skirt element of the dress all cut out. And now you can see how nicely that piece is going to fit in between our two bodice pieces. So the next step is we're just going to sew that back of the skirt piece, and I'm going to do this seam with a French seam, so starting by sewing wrong sides together with a very small seam allowance. And then I'm going to trim away the excess fabric, and then iron open that seam, and then fold it over and iron it again flat. So now we've got our right sides together with the seam tucked in, and we're going to do our second seam of the French seam. You can absolutely do a normal seam for the back of the skirt by just placing right sides together, but I prefer a French seam. Now moving on to the hem of the skirt, where we're just going to fold our fabric over twice and iron it down, and then sew over that with a straight stitch. Our next step is to cut out the 4 bust pieces out of our real fabric. I didn't have enough fabric, but it is preferable to cut these pieces on the bias. And then with these new pieces, we're going to sew all 4 of the side seams, placing right sides together. Now we're going to attach 2 of our bust pieces to the circle skirt. And we're going to start by cutting a 1 centimeter slit at the very point of the fabric. And then we're going to pin right sides together the bust piece to the circle skirt. And then we can sew along where we pinned. And we're going to do the exact same for the other bust piece. My bust piece doesn't have much gathering, but if yours does, you may want to sew the gathering first and then attach your piece. Now taking the other 2 pieces, we're going to attach those right sides together, pinning around just the armholes. And then we're going to sew along the 2 armholes where we pinned. Then flipping our fabric right side out, we can iron down that new seam that we just created. To help iron our seam flat, we may want to cut out a couple notches at the more curved area of our sleeve. You can see it'll really help the fabric lay flat. Next, we're going to iron down our 1 centimeter seam allowance around the neckline and around the under bust. And we're going to direct the excess seam allowance up towards the top of the dress. And you can see here, this will allow us to tuck in all of our raw edges. And then we're going to pin down where we just ironed along the neckline and around the underbust. The point of this step is to have no raw edges poking through. So continue to just use your iron and pins to keep everything in place. So as you can see, all the pins I'm placing of the underbust are right in the seam allowance and are catching the fabric from behind. And all of our seam allowance is tucked in between the layers of fabric. This is a step that would have been a little easier to do before attaching the bra pieces to the circle skirt, but it's no problem to do it now, and we're just going to create a bias strip to finish off that back part of the dress. So I'm just unstitching about 2 centimeters of each of the back bra pieces, and then I'm going to insert my bias strip right sides together with the circle skirt and sew it straight. And then I'm going to iron the seam allowance up towards the strip, fold my bias strip over, iron it down, and fold it over again. And then placing pins right in the seam, catching the fabric behind it. So you could have added this strip before attaching those back pieces, and it just gives the dress a cleaner finish. And here I'm just sewing along where I pinned. And that's our bias strip finished, and then we can reattach those back pieces. And you're going to reattach that piece with the seam allowance folded over. And we're going to sew those back down for both sides. Now you can do any final pinning and ironing of the neckline and the underbust, making sure that everything's tucked in and in place before we sew it. Then we're going to sew along where we pinned with a straight stitch. As you can see, that cut seam allowance is just tucked in between the bodice pieces. And then I'm going to do the exact same steps for the other side of the dress. Trimming the seam allowance at the curves to make for a sharper edge, folding the edges by 1 centimeter and ironing it all down, and then attaching the 2 layers with pins. And then just like the other side, you're going to sew along where you pinned with a straight stitch. The final step is I'm going to add some extra ribbon and elastic details. By adding the elastic, it's going to create a little more shape to the dress, and then I'm going to do a lace trim at the bottom. I'm going to sew the elastic with a zigzag stitch right underneath the bust of the dress along the seam that I created, and I'm going to pull the elastic slightly as I sew to create some ruching. And then I'm going to continue sewing the elastic along the neckline. The elastic is totally optional, but I just like the way the added detail looks. Then I'm going to add a lace trim around the entire bottom of the dress. Then I can trim away any of the extra elastic or lace. The final step is I decided to make some bows out of my lace and hand stitch 2 onto the back and 1 onto the front of my dress. These bows can also be sewn with your sewing machine, but I just find it a little easier to do by hand. And you're all done! Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please subscribe.